Hello, everyone. I'm Carolyn Eastman, a member of the faculty in American History at VCU's History Department. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this, the 13th annual lecture on the history of the American Revolutionary Era. And I have to note that although I did this introduction in person at the actual talk, the sound was off, so I'm re-recording it here. So this lecture is sponsored by the Society of the Cincinnati in the state of Virginia. Every year, the Society's generosity allows us to invite a scholar whose work on the Revolutionary Era has the potential to shift our thinking, and this year is no exception. And I want to give special thanks to the Society because although VCU is not a rich university, it seems as if every year we tighten our belts even more. And so special events like this really make college life rich and meaningful for all of us. We're so grateful for the Society's generosity. I also want to thank Andrea White and Kathleen Murphy in the History Department who've worked behind the scenes to ensure that everything goes well. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Mary Sarah Bilder to present tonight's talk. Mary Sarah is Founders Professor of Law at Boston College Law School, where she specializes in the areas of property, trusts, and estates, and American legal and constitutional history. It's also a pleasure to learn that this isn't her first visit to Richmond. Originally from Wisconsin, she spent a lot of time here as a very young Harvard Law School grad when she clerked for the Fourth Circuit, which met frequently here in the city. Above all, Dr. Bilder has built her reputation as a foundational scholar of the early history of the Constitution. She's the author of many journal articles and 3 prize-winning books that explore the transatlantic concept of written constitutionalism and the specific nature of how the U.S. Constitution was revised and developed. Just to mention one of them, her wonderful 2015 book, Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention, received the Bancroft Prize in American History and the James C. Bradford Prize for Biography from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. And it was also named a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. Her new book, Female Genius, continues this preoccupation with the early history of the U.S. Constitution, but from a surprising angle. It traces the transatlantic history of a long overlooked woman named Eliza Harriot, who emigrated to the United States in the midst of post-revolutionary political turmoil. Harriet's activity as a high-level teacher of girls and as a public speaker during the 1780s earned her a reputation as a woman of exceptional talents. But she also may have had an outsized impact on the writing of the U.S. Constitution. Ultimately, what this impressive book shows us is that when thinking about the constitutional foundations of this country, we need to look beyond the usual male characters to see the ways that constitutional thinking emerged from a much broader range of historical actors than we've previously understood. Please join me in welcoming Mary Sarah Bilder to VCU.
I want to thank Professor Eastman and the Society of the Cincinnati in the state of Virginia and Andrea White for her wonderful assistance. I still remember when I casually mentioned to Professor Eastman, who I had just met, how much I enjoyed her wonderful book on female oration and how I was working on Eliza Harriot. And she mentioned that her friend Granville Ganter was also working on Eliza Harriot. And that made me believe that if 2 people in the universe thought Eliza Harriot was interesting, it probably was an okay project. And so I'm very, very grateful to Professor Eastman for that. I always begin when I talk about Eliza Harriot with her own words, which are the epigraph of the book. And you see on the screen here, the exertions of a female should be considered as presenting an example to be imitated and improved on by future candidates for literary fame. And Eliza Harriot believed in the power of the example, the influence that one person had by presenting an example which would inspire others and future generations. And this idea was the theory on which she understood her extraordinary lecturing and female schools. And this belief that Eliza Harriot had I think can be found in the Society of the Cincinnati's commitment to promoting the ideals of liberty and democracy that were at the heart of the American Revolution through their commitment to educational institutions and to scholarships. And I'm so very pleased to have been invited to participate in this lecture that they sponsor here at VCU. As we'll see, Eliza Harriot believed deeply in an American future in which young students could fully participate in American life. Now, at the outset, let me explain that I have a sort of picture book approach to my slides with multiple images. And for people who like to count, because I'm kind of a restless listener, there should be 28 slides. You'll see there's a lot of them. Whoops. Okay, and if not, I'll just be like, slide. When we think about the framing of the Constitution, we tend to think about the event in the way that public art depicts the moment. And so the classic images of the framers depict the founding as about the men inside the room. No one's part of that story except the white male delegates. And you see probably the two most famous images here, the Howard Christie picture that's in the House of Representatives, and then it's larger than life-size, the Barry Faulkner mural at the National Archives. And Jefferson described this crowd as an assembly of demigods. And indeed, there are no demigoddesses in this assembly. And yet Cleo, the muse of history, was a demigoddess. She was the child of Zeus and Mnemosyne, the Titan of memory. And she's long provided inspiration for prominent female artists and writers, very importantly, Frances Ackland here, Artemisia Gentileschi, and Angelica Kaufman, the first women to become members of male art associations. And so she also was the name that I won out in our family vote on name for our new puppy. So we have a puppy, that's our puppy there. Okay. And Cleo reminds us that history creates power by selecting what we remember about the past. And I believe we've misremembered the imaginative space around the framing of the Constitution. And so this project's part of a larger argument I've made about how we should think about this period. As opposed to founders or framers, I like to think about a framing generation and the way in which people outside of Independence Hall influenced the way that the 1787 Constitution was drafted and its system of government imagined. Now, I like to link the story I tell to the place that I'm speaking, and connecting to the Society of the Cincinnati directly was a little bit difficult because, as we'll see, Eliza Harriot's uncle was Admiral of the British fleet and on the other side from the Society of the Cincinnati in the Revolution. But her interest in expanding a French academy to the United States forms an important part of the history of Richmond and actually VCU's own campus. As a young man imitating the Marquis de Lafayette, a man named Alexandre Marie de Chevalier Quesnay de Beaurepaire arrived in Virginia in 1777. He was commissioned as a French captain by the Virginia militia and then given the job of starting a French academy. He hung out in Virginia for a number of years and then took off to Philadelphia between 1780 and 1783, where he attempted to form a French academy. He made some important connections. He met Sarah Bache, Benjamin Franklin's daughter, who wrote about Quesnay's plan. As a mother who desires to give her children a useful and polite education, and who will be especially proud to have them trained in her own country under her own eyes, I pray you give Monsieur Quesnay all the assistance that may lie in your power. But Quesnay was not particularly successful in Philadelphia, nor in New York, which he tried next. But in the fall of 1785, he relocated to Richmond, where he was embraced by the local community. In the summer of 1786, the cornerstone for his French Academy was laid in a prominent ceremony, and the building quickly built. It became known as the Richmond Academy, and it was located on what I believe is the VCU campus, where the monumental church and the old medical college stood. And Quesnay imagined an ambitious American Academy of Arts and Sciences with branches in the other major cities. He set off to France to raise funds, and this on the left is a printing of one of his very significant proposals with subscription lists for his fundraising. Unfortunately for Quesnay, Jefferson was extremely negative on the enterprise. He was then ambassador to France, arguing that Richmond was too impoverished to properly support such a venture. And then Quesnay got caught up in the French Revolution and never returned. In the meantime, the Academy was used as the location for the Virginia Convention to ratify the Constitution. And then it became a theater, and then eventually the site of the tragic 1811 fire. Quesnay's transatlantic aspirations in imagining that the United States would be open to an Enlightenment-style belles lettres education was shared by the subject of my talk today, Eliza Harriot Behrens O'Connor. And in some ways, both of them had their grand transatlantic ambitions destroyed by the politics of the 1790s. So now let me turn to the subject of my book. At the top of the screen, you see a clause in the Constitution that relates to the president. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull ran for president, the first woman to do so. But since then, we know only men have been elected. And the 28 apparently male pronouns relating to the president in the Constitution might suggest that women were excluded intentionally, or that the framers could not imagine the possibility of inclusion. But in 1788, Hugh Henry Brackenridge read the Constitution as open to a female. His essay mocked the myriad criticisms of the Constitution. Brackenridge began, "The first thing that strikes a diligent observer is the want of precaution with respect to the sex of the president. Is it provided that he shall be of the male gender?" And then he added, "What shall we think if in the process of time we shall come to have an old woman at the head of our affairs?" Heaven forbid, right? Brackenridge similarly asked, "What security have we that he shall be a white man?" And his views on both possibilities are ambiguous, but Brackenridge revealed the Constitution's semantic gender tolerance. Now we see the traditional view in which we imagine this period illustrated in the famous painting often called the Washington family. We see Washington and Martha Washington's grandson on the left with the classic male depictions of power, the sword, and the globe. And we see Martha on the right with her daughter very much configured as women with classic female emblems of power, right? The fan, she's pointing to Pennsylvania Avenue. And included on the right, on what we might think of as the domestic side of the painting, we see William Lee, who was enslaved in Washington's household, accompanied Washington throughout his life, and the new Museum of the American Revolution does a wonderful job reinterpreting Washington's life around William Lee. And we notice that nobody who was a Black woman who was enslaved, like Oni Judge, is depicted in the picture at all. But was this the only way that people imagined the boundaries around power? And for me, this question arose in an entry in George Washington's diary in 1787. Washington was waiting in Philadelphia for the convention to start. He'd been at tea at financier Robert Morris's house, and then he went with Mary White Morris and some other ladies to hear a lady read at the college hall. He later explained that the reading had been a charity affair because the lady, being reduced in circumstance, had recourse to this expedient to obtain a little money. He judged her performance tolerable, which is what Mr. Darcy said about Eliza Bennet, and so I've always judged it a relative success. This lady was herself Elizabeth Harriet Behrens O'Connor, and I will call her Eliza Harriet because that was the part of her name that was her own. She's been largely unknown. There are only 5 extant letters, and so this project was done largely with respect to using digital newspaper research. And my new book reveals her remarkable importance to women's rights and her personal belief that women would reach the college and the political forum. I believe that her lectures influenced the Constitution's gender-neutral language, and her academies influenced countless young women in the new nation. Now, we have no portrait of Eliza Harriot, but perhaps she resembled her cousin, Catherine Hardy, who we see in this lovely Thomas Lawrence portrait on the left. She was born in Lisbon and grew up in England, a member of the aspiring gentry. She was educated in an elite boarding school. Her mother's grandfather and uncle, both Sir Charles Hardy, were admirals, and you see her uncle, Sir Charles Hardy's Romney painting from 1780 there. Her father served as the Boston port collector during James Otis's time and was then postmaster in Charleston during the Stamp Act riots. In 1776, she married John O'Connor, an Irish law student at the Inner Temple. He appeared to be a gentleman, albeit impoverished, with unverified hints of connections to the ancient Irish royal families. And this is a period where many of the Irish who'd had their lands and rights suppressed by the English began to take back claims to their sort of royal lineage. And so they started putting the O's back in and into their names. John was educated during the period when the penal laws that oppressed the Irish Catholics were being relaxed, and their mixed religious marriage speaks to their own belief in the trajectory of political reform. After becoming a barrister in Dublin, John returned to London in the 1780s, and there Eliza Harriot's father died, leaving her the modest income from a trust that her father left her independent of her husband's control. Now, they came of age in the 1770s and the 1780s, and I call this the age of the Constitution. Constitution in this period referred to the framework of government, not to a piece of paper. And people were rethinking assumptions about who should participate in the state. And so for some women, reform raised the possibility of altering an intellectual tradition that embraced female inferiority. As far back as Aristotle, the Western tradition had embraced an ideology of female inferiority. And so, for example, influential educational theorist Rousseau explained, and you see the quote on the top here, the whole education of women ought to be relative to men. He added, reader, I appeal to yourself, be sincere. Which would you esteem the most? A woman who you found employed in the proper occupations of her sex in her domestic concerns, or a female genius, scribbling verses on her toilette and surrounded with pamphlets, and by there he means political pamphlets of all sorts. And thus a radical new idea arose in the English-speaking word female genius, which signified that women had equal capacity and deserved an equal education and political representation. And we can see recognition of female genius just to show a few examples. The 9 Muses of Britain here was painted, showing contemporary female geniuses that Britain was entering a golden age. The African-American poet Phyllis Wheatley gained recognition as a female genius and explicitly included in Mary Hay's poem when she traveled to England. And there's a wonderful new biography by David Waldstreicher out about her. And Catherine Macaulay, the great English constitutional historian, embodied the connection from female genius to political inclusion when she was painted with her constitutional history books wearing the Roman senatorial sash. In London, female debating societies openly debated female representation with their topics printed in the newspaper. And so you can see a couple of the debate topics here. This is my favorite. Ought not the women of Great Britain have a voice in the election of representatives and to be eligible to sit in Parliament as well as men? And many satirical depictions of the female debating societies. And in 1780, the Duchess of Devonshire became well known for political activities on the side of the Fox election. And there's just a huge number of images of her. The top left one is the classic satirical image of what's going to happen if women participate, right? She's participating and her husband's having to change the diapers on the child, right? So we can see how old that sort of motif is. And then also very positive images like the one you see on the right of her and her colleagues politically parading. And this was also the explosion of female readers aided by the rise of the circulating library. And so there's a period where many, many women begin to write books, most of them anonymous. And this is itself a radical idea because it lay claim to the idea not only that women could be authors, not only that women could be buyers of literature or participants in literature in their own right, but that the female mind was interesting enough to occupy an entire book. And that's an extremely radical idea. And Eliza Harriot may have participated in this. She may have been the author of 2 anonymous books, and she may not have even been quite anonymous. Almeria Belmore contains the name E. O'Connor. I read them. Mary Wollstonecraft said they weren't that good. She was right about that. Okay, so I'd like to say they were brilliant, but they aren't. Okay, this possibility of this world crossed the Atlantic. So for example, in 1783 at Princeton, in front of George Washington in Congress, the young graduate Edmund Snowden argued for expanded female education. He said, "There are none of the learned and important employments of life which the female mind has not proved itself able to comprehend and direct." So in this moment, Eliza Harriot and John crossed the Atlantic in 1786 to travel to New York, the capital of the United States. The beginning of an 8-year journey, finding her lecturing and opening academies throughout the United States, beginning and ending her career at Columbia's. And you can see the map here. She's going to travel southward along what at the time was known as the King's Highway. In New York, her new school emphasized the foundation of belles lettres knowledge, which was called the art of reading, as well as needlework, history, math, and geography. Her female school's extraordinary public exams were actually held at Columbia College with the participation of Columbia professors, and then she wrote about that in the newspaper. And although she was exceptionally successful in New York, the students in her school include sort of the most prominent, the daughters of the most prominent men in New York. In a pattern that would repeat itself throughout her life, John's career's decisions altered hers. He was hired as editor of the Philadelphia Columbia magazine, and so they had to move to Philadelphia in early 1787, where a convention was to meet to revise the existing federal constitution. Now, Philadelphia in this period was diverse and cosmopolitan, the largest city in the United States with about 40,000 people. Reform was in the air with the Constitution being about to be rewritten. The Reverend Absalom Jones and the formerly enslaved Richard Allen formed the Free African Society to support the free Black population. The Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery reorganized, allowing members beyond its foundational Quaker membership. And reform interested the remarkable group of elite Philadelphia women, Sarah Franklin Bache, leader of the Ladies Association, Eliza Willing Powell, who's the woman who asked Franklin about the type of government and was told a republic if you can keep it, and who would later urge Washington successfully not to resign at the end of his first term, and Anne Bingham, who we'll see would write Jefferson about the role of women in politics. And as the Constitutional Convention delegates gathered in the spring and summer of 1787, Eliza Harriot gave what I believe to be the first public lecture by a woman in the United States. Beginning Monday, April 2nd, 1787, in every Philadelphia newspaper, Eliza Harriot's ads appeared for a course of lectures at the university. She gave her lectures in University Hall, which was at 4th and Arch, and the location of prominent male lecturers, including that of the American Philosophical Society lecturers and Princeton's Dr. Samuel Smith. Her lectures promoted Enlightenment belles lettres rhetoric, considered the foundation for professions like law and politics. And she gave at least 5 lectures in April, May, and June. Her lectures included selections from Milton, Shakespeare, and Pope, proto-reformers and romantics such as James Thompson, Edward Young and William Shenstone, and the influential lawyer and Orientalist, member of the Constitutional Society, William Jones. She made sure to always include women as authors. She always included a work by Madame de Genlis, the first woman to teach the French royal children, and she included women as subjects, liking to include the story of Xenophon's story of General Cyrus's respect for Panthea. Now, what's interesting is it's hard for us to understand the remarkable nature of a woman speaking in public. But when I went to look for images for this part of the book, I couldn't find any because there are no images of women publicly lecturing. The most prominent image of a woman speaking in front of men in this period was the story of Hortensia, which was pretty widely known in this period because it was reproduced in Boccaccio's concerning famous women, and Hortensia became a very classic name that women use, including Catherine Macaulay. She went to the Roman Forum and basically argued on behalf of women that they should have rights if they were going to pay taxes. As the first convention delegates began to arrive in Philadelphia, a newspaper column, likely written by Eliza Harriot herself, explained the power of the lady lecturer. She argued that her effort was to cultivate and adorn the human mind. She was an example that, as Eliza Harriot put it, in this country, the ladies are found in the society of the sages of the other sex, and they would soon command the honors due to the professors of science. Eliza Harriot predicted in the newspaper, soon the toilette and the drawing room, the two traditional venues for women, would be deserted for the forum and the college. Eliza Harriot's lectures were designed to encourage women to enter college, higher education, and the forum politics. Indeed, she ended her lectures with the prayer on Demosthenes from the Oration of the Crown, the most famous male political speech. All told, there are over 140 ads or commentary about her in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And moreover, George Washington's presence at her May 18th lecture led to accounts of her lecture to be widely printed across the United States. Her lecturing, Washington's presence, and the convention became bound together. Now, in early May 1787, she revealed an even more ambitious plan, a female Academy of Belles Lettres. It would have a governing board, half women, half men, with a woman governess and majority rule voting. A woman was always to lead it who would publicly lecture to 300 people. This is where Eliza Harriot explained the exertions of a female should be an example to be imitated and improved on. Eliza Harriot wanted to be an example, but not the exceptional example that had so often perversely been used as proof of most other women's inferiority. Rather, she wanted to be an example to be emulated and improved on. Eliza Harriot sent her plan to Benjamin Franklin's daughter, Sarah Franklin Bache, and she may have inspired Anne Bingham's June letter to Thomas Jefferson. Bingham praised the education of French women and what she described as their happy variety of genius. She argued that these female geniuses promoted our female privileges and should therefore be admired as the friends of the liberties of mankind reverence the successful struggles of the American patriots. Society of Cincinnati people, I worked it in again. Okay, Jefferson wrote back condescendingly. Jefferson was not good on many things, including gender, that ladies should not wrinkle their foreheads with politics, but should instead soothe and calm the minds of their husband, returning ruffled from political debate. And after that, Anne Bingham's like, I'm not writing you back anymore. So now I believe this example of Eliza Harriot giving lectures, proposing a female Belles Lettres Academy, and predicting that American women would be in the college and forum influenced the Constitution's stylistic phrasing of offices. In state constitutions between 1776 and 1787, we find political participants described in different ways. Some are neutral, using terms like person or inhabitant. Some are generic, what was understood as a generic at the time, using the word he. And a very small number use gender-specific language, like male, and Massachusetts actually is one of those places. Now, the first draft of the Constitution contained gender-specific language. Congress was described as two separate and distinct bodies of men. The pernicious 3/5 clause explicitly referenced inhabitants of every sex. And I think most importantly, the draft fugitive slave clause emphasized that men and women, he or she, escaping to a free state, would be returned to slavery. And this is a remarkable testament to Black women's agency in slavery. Someone like you think of Oni Judge, who would escape from Washington, that the male delegate who proposed that language on the floor of the convention could not think about fugitives without bringing explicitly to mind women. And it's the only she in any of the drafting language. But the final drafting committee removed every gendered reference. And you can see how already there, right, the references are going neutral. And these changes created a neutral constitution with a person, he pattern. Persons became a word to refer to inhabitants of every sex, and he became a generic pronoun. And we know that person, he, has to be interpreted this way because the interstate rendition clause, which relates to people who commit crimes, obviously, if it's not interpreted that way, everyone who's a woman doesn't have to ever be hauled back across state lines. Not once did the word male appear in the Constitution. And so the text of the Constitution thus left open and unanswered what would be the relationship of women to the constitutional state. It left itself curiously open to the possibility of female genius. But for others, female genius proved threatening. So enter Benjamin Rush. He had a remarkable, capacious mind. He was anti-slavery. He was involved in all sorts of reform activities. He had married Juliet Stockton when she was 17 years old, and they had 13 children. And at the time of Eliza Harriot's lectures, Rush served on the all-male board of the newly reorganized female school, the Young Ladies Academy. The men wanted to reform female education as long as they were in charge. In late July, after Eliza Harriot's proposal, Rush gave a widely reprinted speech, Thoughts Upon Female Education. It was designed to destroy Eliza Harriot's plan. Rush took the old female inferiority idea and gave it a new American twist, what historians have since come to call Republican motherhood. Gentlemen should direct female education. British ideas were un-American. French should not be taught. Most importantly, young ladies should be educated to be an agreeable companion for a sensible man and the daughter or wife of an American citizen. And in thinking about what that meant, directed at Eliza Harriet O'Connor, particularly in a world with an enormous amount of Irish Catholic prejudice, one can hear the nativism. At Rush's Young Ladies Academy, the girls reminded of this fact, this limited goal, on the covers of the notebooks they took notes in. Eliza Harriet stood no chance. Rush's opposition doomed Eliza Harriet's Academy. She moved first to Baltimore, where she offered lectures on the compass of the human mind, right? The human mind, not just the male mind. Her tickets were sold by Mary Catherine Goddard, who was the first person to print the Declaration of Independence with the signer's name. And then at the bottom of that very famous imprint, she added her own, right, printed by Mary Catherine Goddard. And then Eliza Harriet moved to Alexandria, where she started a female school, which George Washington supported. And when her husband moved on to Edenton, North Carolina, Eliza Harriot managed to get herself invited to Mount Vernon to consult with George and Martha Washington about her future. She eventually moved to Charleston in 1790 to found a female French and English academy. And perhaps because of connections made when her father briefly served there, undoubtedly because of the socioeconomic advantages of her whiteness in a city built on slavery, her school in Charleston was successful and flourished. The curriculum expanded to include astronomy, and she may have crossed paths with Washington when he came south on his southern tour. Now, she was not alone in her view that women were equal to men and that education, oratory, and political participation were linked. Female education was actually political. It proved that women were equal to men. And we can see this linking in the publications of the far more famous Mary Wollstonecraft. So in 1787, when Eliza Harriot's first lecturing, Wollstonecraft publishes her thoughts on the education of daughters. Catherine Macaulay, the constitutional historian, actually started her own book on female education that year, although it would not be published until 1790. Female education emphasized oratory, speaking out loud, being in the public eye. And in 1789, Wollstonecraft published anonymously The Female Reader. The art of reading became a way for young women to invade public spaces. And then in January 1792, Wollstonecraft published Rights of Woman, positively initially received in the United States. And the front illustration to volume 1 of the Philadelphia Ladies magazine showed the genius of the magazine presenting liberty with the rights of women. Wollstonecraft lamented that women have not a road open by which they could pursue more extensive plans of usefulness and independence. And then she wrote, I may excite laughter by dropping a hint which I mean to pursue some future time. For I really think that women ought to have representatives instead of being arbitrarily governed without having any direct share allowed them in the deliberation of government. And we can see now that exclusion in this period was a custom, unjust and detrimental. Those very words appear in 1790 in a very widely reprinted newspaper comment. Exclusion was a custom, not a constitutionally or legally required bar. And women should not be obliged to submit to laws they had no share of making. It was unjust and detrimental. Women are equal to the males. And indeed, the custom of female exclusion did not exist everywhere. Women and people of color voted in this period in New Jersey under a 1776 constitution that stated that all inhabitants could vote if they were worth 50 pounds. In 1790, legislation explicitly used he or she to describe who was eligible to vote, and 7 years later, another piece of legislation referred to his or her ballot. Extant poll lists show many women voters. Indeed, a critic in the 1800s complained that over 10,000 women had voted. In 1793, at the Young Ladies Academy, young graduate Priscilla Mason, who could have heard Eliza Harriot speak 6 years earlier, gave a speech which has become a famous primary document and appears wonderfully interpreted in Professor Eastman's book. She protested limits on women. Supposing now we possessed all the talents of the orator in the highest perfection, where shall we find a theater for the display of them? The church, the bar, the Senate are shut against us. And who shut them? Man, despotic man, first made us incapable of the duty and then forbid us the exercise. Let us by suitable education qualify ourselves for those high departments. They will open before us. The trajectory was clear. Education, oratory, and the doors of the Senate and the bar would open. But this vision and Eliza Harriot's collapsed. In the spring of 1792, a large financial crisis rocked the United States. And in Charleston, Eliza Harriot's husband found himself caught in the financial crisis and brought her down with him. She published an ad to excuse the interruption in her business produced by the disorder in Mr. O'Connor's pecuniary engagements, and they left across state lines fleeing debts. And so too, the vision promoted by Harriot, Wollstonecraft, and others collapsed after 1792. There's a variety of explanations, and I've listed some up there, but they resulted in what historian Rosie Zagari calls a backlash against women's inclusion in the constitutional state. Particularly importantly, the rise of the new genre of the written constitution converted what had been custom to very sticky constitutional law. As new states entered the Union, voter requirements shifted. In 1792, the new state of Kentucky broadened suffrage for white men. It became the first Western state to permit men to vote without property or tax-paying requirements. But it did so by describing voters as free male citizens. The language resembled the 1792 Federal Militia Act, which stated that every free, able-bodied white male citizen was to enroll, and drew on some Southern constitutions. By 1799, Kentucky had excluded free people of color from voting or bearing arms in the militia. By 1802, the Kentucky model proved dominant across the United States. Every state admitted to the Union between 1802 and 1876 defined suffrage by constitutional exclusion. The laws always began with an adjective, free or white, and after 1820, almost always white. And they ended with a description, person, inhabitant, citizen. But what never varied across these decades was the inclusion of the word male. Indeed, in 1807, New Jersey reversed course and passed a new law limiting voting to free white male citizens. By the 19th century, greater participation in government had occurred. By 1840, in theory, more than 90% of white men could vote, but at a great cost. Like people of color, women found themselves now constitutionally excluded because they were not white males. What historians used to call the rise of democracy in the 1820s is actually something that doesn't look very much like democracy. Now, Eliza Harriot's life followed this same decline. In 1793, she moved to Columbia, where she started a female seminary devoted to improving the female mind. John vanishes completely. I like to think he went back to Ireland and died in the Irish Revolution, but I don't know. He might have died of like yellow fever. Eliza Harriot maintained her ambition despite in this last ad, and that's the last ad she published, describing her feeble attempts at teaching. She at the same time proposed opening an evening school to teach French. But when she died in 1811, she was the boarder in someone else's house. She owned relatively little: books, a spectacle, sewing materials, a chamber pot. Yet she tried to exert control over this by writing a will and signing her name. Despite many years of looking, I could find no gravestone for her. Now, what influence did she have? Well, we don't know precisely, but recall Eliza Harriot's theory. The exertions of a female should be considered as presenting an example to be imitated and improved on by future candidates for fame. And if we look carefully, we see examples following the path that Eliza Harriot first tried to open, each imitated and improved on by the next women. So Black women's rights activists like the Philadelphia Fortin sisters were educated often at female academies, grew comfortable speaking as public lecturers, often tried teaching, and for them, education and the vote was bound together. Indeed, the first woman in the United States to vote under unrestricted suffrage was Utah school teacher Sarah Young in 1870, and Mary Ann Shadd Cary, the first Black teacher and later lawyer, registered to vote the first time in 1871. So return for a moment to Columbia, the place where Eliza Harriot died. In 1869, the South Carolina legislature invited any lady to give a speech arguing for women's rights to vote. And only one lady, Charlotte Rollin, accepted. Rollin was a South Carolina Black woman, educated much like Eliza Harriot, fluent in French and belles letters. And her speech argued passionately for Black women and all women to claim the franchise. She argued it was a fundamental and constitutional right belonging to humanity in general. The New York Times mocked her argument, which they explained as because the Constitution does not include the word male, sex was unknown to the Constitution, and therefore women had the right to vote. Rollin managed to make sure her speech was printed, and so copies survive today. And she continued to work with women's suffrage associations, arguing for the right to representation. In May 1787, George Washington heard Eliza Harriot deliver a lecture on the power of eloquence, on the power of being an example. And in the 1780s, the age of the Constitution rearranged assumptions about who constituted the state. Female genius became a rebuttal to alleged female inferiority, and the Constitution, importantly, was stylistically framed consistent with this idea. But Eliza Harriot's example also inspired male opposition, and in the 1790s, as female genius transformed into the rights of woman, opposition grew and took the new constitutional state and converted it to one defined by exclusion. But who knows what ripples went forth from her lectures, her schools, and perhaps most importantly, her many newspaper ads. As an early example of the path from female education towards the college and the full forum, her performance strikes me as certainly more than tolerable. So thank you very much.